Hi, welcome to FinTrail's FinCrime Spotlight. I'm Ciara and I'm joined today by James and Maya. So last week, we saw that the UK government published its Economic Crime Plan 2, which sets out the government's priorities in tackling financial crime over the next 3 years. It's underpinned by £400 million worth of investment, so £200 million from the government and £200 million from the economic crime levy, which will be taken directly from the financial services sector. So the plan acts as a bit of an overarching document above the forthcoming fraud strategy and alongside a new anti-corruption strategy that we should see over the coming months. And it has three key aims. One, reducing money laundering and recovering more criminal assets. Two, combating kleptocracy and driving down sanctions evasions. And three, cutting fraud. So I think broadly, if progressed and successfully implemented, it really could make meaningful change in the UK's approach. But I think at 90 pages, it's a pretty chunky read, and you may not have had the time to digest it. So Maya, do you want to kick off today's discussion? We'll be drawing out some of the key highlights of the plan.
Sure. Yeah, we've done all the hard work reading it in detail, so you don't have to. There are a number of quite different areas of focus covered in the plan. So I'll just run through some of the headline items it announces. It follows on from the announcement from the Treasury last week of where some of the money from the economic crime levy is going to be spent. So it talks about investing in people and technology. So hiring an extra 475 new investigators across different teams and investing £100 million in state-of-the-art new technology. On corruption, it's going to expand the National Crime Agency's Combating Kleptocracy cell to target corrupt elites and enablers. It's setting up a new crypto cell, combining law enforcement agencies and regulators to pool expertise and enforcement tools, which is a completely new area and a new unit. It talks about aligning priorities across the public and private sectors, which is a different approach to priority setting than we've seen before. And it talks about ambitious reforms of the UK supervisory regime, although it notes changes could take a period of years, so quite vague and open-ended. But it indicates that would focus on greater information and intelligence sharing. And again, this isn't a new announcement, but it talks about increased powers for Companies House, which would be part of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill, which is currently going through the House of Lords. So we've heard this before, but it sets out again that this would give Companies House additional powers, and it would introduce a verification process for verifying the identities of people setting up, managing, or owning companies. So I think those are the main action items and areas of focus that it drills into.
Yeah, thanks, man. I think a lot of this has been very much welcomed and received well across the private and public sector. I think the report itself does touch on the fact that through the UK, the estimates currently sit around 100 billion is being laundered through UK or UK registered corporate structures every year. And as you touched on, it draws out a number of areas to address this. So Companies House reform and SAR reform being another area. And there's a big focus on it within it on asset recoveries. And I think we touched on in a previous episode where we'd seen record highs of asset recoveries of the previous financial year. I think it was 354 million recovered in 21-22, and the plan is to increase that to $1 billion over the next 10 years. So James, do you want to maybe touch on what the plan is doing to address this, and crucially, is it enough?
Well, I guess I'll play the glass half empty kind of role here, and the strapline is probably not right, but maybe let's have a think about some of those minor, more kind of specific kind of figures within that. So I think $1 billion in criminal asset recovery sounds a lot, but I think, Kieran, keep me saying it's over the next 10 years. And I think obviously you just quoted a completely different kind of figure of how much ultimately is laundered through certain kind of corporate structures and the wider ecosystem. £1 billion is not really that much in the grand scale of things. So I think there's a question mark whether that actually really is hitting the mark in terms of worth the effort. I think the other point is that they've committed to 100 million on technology, but I think there's still a question mark on what that actually means. There's also 475 not just newly trained investigators, they're highly trained investigators at the disposal, obviously, to kind of work on this specifically. And then finally, to one particular confusing bit, which I do not like, is that we have another AMLA, maybe spelt slightly different, but another kind of acronym based around AMLA, which is called the Anti-Money Laundering and Asset Recovery, which is a new task or a new area to specifically focus on building out capacity across the system to increase intelligence, investigative capability, and deliver, improved technology. But that's a particular one that we're going to all find confusing, seeing it's the third AMLA in close proximity within Europe and the wider ecosystem as well. So that's an interesting one. So I guess to summarize, is it really moving the needle? So the headlines all sound great. Obviously, it's a proportionality and what is actually achievable. But I think what we really need to see from a success perspective is we really need to see some focus on an actually proper public-private partnership process. And we always talk about it. I think we're all been bored of it the last 10 years. So we need to see that be, worked effectively. And also another kind of topic that we're probably all very bored of, but is also important, is the information sharing process between the regulated sector and the public sector as well. So I think, or the private sector, sorry. So that's another area that we actually need some progress to be seen there to make it effective as well.
Yeah, I think that commitment from both private and public sector, the desire is certainly there. It's how that commitment now translates out of the actions that are associated with these bits of the plan. So we touched on sort of funding as well, and the headline 400 million figure, it seems a lot, but there's been a lot of commentary on, is that enough? And I think so there's been reference to smoke and mirrors and a lack of funding from some of the media reports we've been seeing on this. So Maya, do you want to maybe talk through your thoughts on that and what that means for delivery of the plan as well?
Yeah. So there have been criticisms around the financing of the plan, and some experts and MPs say that it is still underfunded despite those seeming like good headline figures. So the smoke and mirrors quote, I think, is from Margaret Hodge, who's a Labour MP and also the head of the all-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption. She's written an open letter in which she criticises the funding and says that despite this grand reveal, she calls it, of this additional 400 million, it's actually, I think she says, reheating 200 million of previously committed government spending, plus the 200 million from the economic crime levy, so the private sector contributions. So she says that means there's actually no new government investment being announced in economic crime through this plan. Actually, there's a line, it's a good one, so I'll just read it from that open letter. So she says the paltry 200 million the government has managed to scrape together is in fact the same amount that it committed for fixing potholes in its recent budget, not exactly commensurate with the 290 billion that fraud and money laundering is costing us annually. So pretty scathing comments from her. And other experts have called out the funding as well. So RUSI, for instance, have said that extra 475 investigators is not enough to turn the tide on decades of underinvestment. And the same is probably also true of the 100 million pledged for new technology. If you think of where we're starting from, which is years and years of criticism of how underfunded all of this has been, it's not like there's a perfectly adequate system and now we're investing 100 million to make it state of the art. Like, there is a lot of investment needed just to bring it up to where it needs to be to function somewhat adequately. So that money may not go as far as it's immediately indicated. There was also, sort of dovetailing with that, comments from RUSI and from other critics, both on the funding, but also on some of the content of the plan and some of the areas that are still missing, and which would also presumably have to be covered by that overall funding figure. So one of them is fraud. And you mentioned, Ciara, that the fraud strategy that this is going to sit alongside, that was due in July last year, and it's still described in this plan as forthcoming. So there's still no clear date of when it would be published. And bearing in mind, fraud accounts for, I think, 41% of all crime experienced by adults in England and Wales, and the figures are extremely high for the amount of money that's estimated to be lost to fraud. So again, to actually tackle that level of fraud adequately within that overall figure allocated under the plan is going to be challenging. So the government's committing 100 million to tackle fraud, but the details of what that would be spent on at this point without the fraud strategy is still quite vague. And they've talked about disrupting criminals' ability to commit fraud and bring them to justice more quickly, preventing fraud by reducing the number of fraudulent communications that get through to the public, and empowering people to recognise and report fraud. But that second one is really interesting. So at the moment, the plan doesn't address the role of big tech or telecommunications companies, who would obviously have to be involved if you're talking about reducing fraudulent, phishing emails and spam SMSs, etc. And RUSI have highlighted that the government has to engage with social media and tech companies in its response, which would be something new. And at the moment, we don't have the details of that. And the other area in terms of content that RUSI calls out that's still really missing under the plan is around sanctions. And it says that the government doesn't have a good long-term strategy for actually removing the assets of sanctioned Russians. So it can freeze them, but there isn't a lot beyond that. So RUSI calls the actions in the plan a timid starting point. And it says that it needs to move beyond just sanctions to long-term criminal justice responses. And again, that would be covered in the anti-corruption strategy, which is name-checked in this plan. But again, that's still forthcoming and no date's been given yet. So when those two come out, there will be some additional action specifically, but which again would then have to be funded.
I was just going to add as well, it's interesting the political power struggles that we will see that's between mum and dad of a Conservative government and obviously Labour initiatives there, and how those three priorities actually formalise a little bit, because clearly, the between fraud, kleptocracy and all of that kind of pieces, there's going to be different priorities depending on the government as well. So I think there is definitely a power struggle there that is going to be interesting to follow.
Yeah, and the fact that they are trying to cover so many diverse areas of criminal activity within this plan, as you say, like it's then going to be scrapping for those resources to some extent. You have these investigators, where are they going to be allocated? Where's the priority going to be? Because this is the point of, like, it sounds like a high number, but actually is that enough to tackle fraud and corruption and all the other areas of financial crime which technically fall under this plan?
And they're also picking from a talent pool that's highly competitive as well, too, across the private sector. And it is in some cases, very well remunerated as well. So is the money going to be where their mouth is in terms of how they're funding the types of these highly trained investigators and what they're prepared to pay as well to bring them on board?
You laughed when they wanted to hire 30 people for OFSI in Durham or something a few years back. So, not an easy task, you're right.
No, it isn't. So, and I think, look, obviously a lot of glass sort of half empty, but it's been good that the plan hasn't been done in isolation as well. It's not just been taken from the Home Office doing this without consultation with private sector. And UK Finance have been part of the plan, and they have a couple of actions as owners, and they co-own and contribute to a number more. But notwithstanding that, traditionally UK Finance has been dominated by the big banks, and with the growth of fintechs and financial services, it's really important that they have a voice in some of the actions that are particularly attributed to the private sector. So James, do you want to maybe touch on that and why it's important to have fintechs on the table in these?
Yeah, well, definitely. So, I think it's probably important to note that UK Finance generally do a very, very good job, and we're lucky as a country to have an organisation that like them that are separate from the government to try and move initiatives forward, and it definitely bridges the gap of having the relevant SME knowledge involved from that perspective. But I guess, being critical, not of UK Finance specifically, but obviously they are very much a bank-led organisation. So what we want to make sure from a wider ecosystem perspective is that there is enough opinions flying the other areas of relevance as well. So, whatever fintech means, whether it's payment firms, whether it's lending firms, whether it's everything under the sun other than a bank, we want to make sure that ultimately there is that voice of reason covering some of those other areas as well. And specifically in two areas, there is obviously the making sure we're working with the NECC to ensure that the relevant risks and threats are understood outside of the banking world. but then also making sure because again, related to this particular area and the initiatives that we understand that UK Finance will be working on, back to the information sharing and the flow of information, ensuring that information is flowing to the correct people and not just the banks as well, I think is the other item. So those two things, making sure the threats are understood and making sure the information is shared effectively throughout the wider ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think they bring real opportunities to really look at sort of what prioritization of resources are, where the focus is coming out, and how that is sort of going to be truly more threat-led as well too. So I think if we can get this right and fit for purpose for the whole of the financial services sector, I think that could add a lot of value. So then Maya, as we come sort of maybe concluding the conversation, but effectiveness is sort of mentioned any time now we talk about economic financial crime, and sort of the universal question is what does it mean, and what is it sort of what does effectiveness may look like from a success perspective, and it's an area that this report equally focuses on. And I think we've got action 43 which specifically calls out around measuring effectiveness, but there are no tangible measures as such within the plan. So it might be a good area just to sort of conclude our discussion on what this means for the economic crime plan.
Yeah, so this is really baffling, and it's where I'm like, have I read this wrong? Am I not understanding this correctly? So Action 43 is to develop an outcomes framework for the economic crime plan too. So they've launched the plan, but they don't have an outcomes framework. And as it stands, the dates are then to establish initial priority indicators for how they're going to measure effectiveness and if the plan is working by Q3 this year, and then provide a formal update on progress in developing data and indicators by Q4 next year. So at the end of next year, they're going to give us an update on how far they've got with working out how they're going to measure the effectiveness of the plan. So that's an obvious gap, right? People will be trying to implement this plan and do these actions, but with no idea if what they're doing is effective, because no one has worked out how we're going to measure or track that yet until we're a year and 3/4 into the plan, which, yeah, is kind of baffling. And it's obviously something that could have been worked out alongside the plan. It's not like you need to launch the plan and then work out how you're going to measure the effectiveness. And again, bringing in another external commentator here, so John Cusack, the chair of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, who said there's a lot to do over the 3 years of the economic crime plan by many people, not all of whom have stellar track records as far as effective execution is concerned, which I think is fair. And he also points out this Action 43 is owned by the Home Office, which obviously has a number of competing priorities, and this possibly isn't one of them. And there's the general election next year, et cetera, et cetera. So it is worrying that we don't know what good looks like or how we're going to measure it or assess how well the plan is doing until maybe the end of next year, by which point there will be an update on how we might want to do that.
The plan needs a plan.
Yeah, the plan needs a plan. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, and I think as the UK has often been criticised as sort of having the lack of political will to truly tackle dirty money and illicit money in the UK. Like obviously, as you point out, or as John Cusack has pointed out, the number of competing priorities that this government will have alongside the election is how much that political will remain to really truly make this as effective as it can be. So a lot of good initiatives, definitely the much needed and welcomed step in the right direction, but let's see what substance lies beneath all of this to really change the needle over the next 3 years. Thanks. Well, thanks both for the discussion today. Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.